So what I'm going to try to do is cover the 16 years from the tribunal up until present time. And what I'm going to do is, instead of giving you dates and times and people, I'm going to try to lay out some overall themes to look at what it seems to me has been going on during the brief amount of time that I've been involved in the movement. I would say, I'm sorry to say this, that 1993 in many ways was a high point in our sovereignty movement.
Turning point.
And a turning point as well, because what happened shortly after that, after 1993, which was, the centennial observance of the overthrow, there was a huge march through downtown Honolulu. What happened shortly after that was the state of Hawaii got really good at co-opting the sovereignty movement. And if not, and it may be too much to say that they were able to co-opt the movement, but they were certainly able to co-opt some of the energy and some of the language of sovereignty. And so they instituted the Sovereignty Advisory Commission, or the council, I can't remember what it stood for, the SAC, right? And then followed by HSEC, the Hawaiian Sovereignty Elections Council. And this is where I probably should do my own mea culpa, because I was involved with Ha Hawaii, which is a successor organization to HSEC. And that was followed by the Native Hawaiian Convention in 1999. And that represented an effort by the state of Hawaii to co-opt and also to direct the sovereignty movement in a particular direction. What I find really interesting, though, about their attempt, and I should say that the state of Hawaii is it's not a single person or a single set of ideas. There's lots of different people that comprise the state of Hawaii. For instance, I would think that John Waihee, the governor at the time, probably had some actual desire to see progress made in sovereignty, but there are other forces in the state of Hawaii as well that wanted to steer it in other directions. And certainly, it represents, I think, an overall attempt to close off the Hawaiian question, which is the biggest question, it's the big question of the last 115 years or so, dealing with these natives, of all these outstanding claims. And that's something that I think we keep on coming back to, is the Hawaiian question. Of course, the flip side of the Hawaiian question is the U.S. imperial question. And I think it's always important for us to turn that around and say, well, you want us to come to a consensus and get together, but the real problem is your occupation and colonization of our country. So you deal with that. What I find really interesting, though, about the state's attempt in the late 90s to direct the sovereignty movement is that the Native Hawaiian Convention, which was an elected group of delegates that came out of this process, they actually voted for independence. They said that there should be an option for independence, and they decided to push for that option. Of course, shortly after that, Office of Hawaiian Affairs cut the budget. There was no longer any kind of institutional support for the Native Hawaiian Convention. And I think a lot of that is because it had turned on its original, those people in the state who wanted it to be a closure to the quote-unquote Hawaiian question. The second major theme is the backlash by conservative forces. And the big one is, in 2000, there was the Rice v. Cayetano lawsuit. It was sort of a broadside to, I think, the sovereignty movement at the time, and it was followed by a whole bunch of other lawsuits. It seemed to come on like a regular seasonal schedule. And they were all attempts to attack various Hawaiian programs. Some of them which aren't really Hawaiian programs, like OHA, but to attack things which were identified as institutions or things that are valuable for the Hawaiian community. And I don't want to ascribe a conspiracy, but the other thing that happened in 2000 is the introduction of the Ikaika bill. And you can see actually how these two things work side by side. They work together. On one hand, you have attacks by the conservative, the far-right elements in Hawaii and U.S. politics attacking Hawaiian interests. And on the other side, you have the state of Hawaii, you have OHA, you have kind of more conservative Hawaiian elements that are pushing the Ikaika bill, because and this is what they say that this will protect Hawaiians from these lawsuits. And so the two work together. They play on fear. They play on legitimate community fear, Hawaiian community fear about the loss of Hawaiian programs. And so those two things together, they force, they really are assaults on the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, and they force Hawaiian sovereignty activists to respond and to be reactionary against that. Another trend of the late 1990s is the collapse, unfortunately, of major Hawaiian sovereignty groups such as Kalahui Hawaii. And I was never a member of Kalahui, and the reason I didn't join was because Kalahui didn't push for independence, and I always wanted independence. But its collapse, I think, was palpable in our community because, for one, Kalahui was able to mobilize people. It was able to exact concessions from the state of Hawaii and from major state and federal powers. And it was also able to demonstrate Hawaiian power, Hawaiian force. And that's something that I think is really important, the idea that Kalahui was able to really galvanize Hawaiian power. The next thing that I want to point out is something which is on one hand a victory, on the other hand a defeat, which is, it seems that if you were to look at the longer trend over the last 4 or 5 decades, there really has been an important victory in terms of a general recognition in the public, in the large general public, that there has been an injustice against Hawaiians and against the Hawaiian kingdom, and that there should be something done about it. There were polls that the Honolulu Advertiser commissioned which said that there was actually a majority of people who believed that there should be some form of sovereignty. And I think it's important that we see that that is a victory over what the consensus was 40 years before that, or 80 years before that, in which there would have been very little conversation and, in fact, a general belief that Hawaiians were lazy. In my parents' generation, kanaka was a bad word. It was an epithet. It was a racial epithet, a slur. And I think things have changed. The flip side, though, of this general consensus is that you also have political correctness. You have businesses, state governments, major organizations that want to look like they're pro-Hawaiian, like they have some inklings towards being pro-sovereignty, but in fact they're not. You have the rise of public relations firms, which spend lots of money to create veneers of Hawaiianness. You have American Savings Bank, where my checking account is at, that uses a taro field as its, on its advertising, etc. You have state offices that are suddenly very eager to have the correct okinas and kahakos on the spellings of words, while they evict our people. And part of it is also the rise of a mass movement which isn't necessarily clear about what it stands for. And one of the examples of that is the Kui Kopono marches, in which it's not clear at all who the marches are targeted at. Who is, we're marching down the street, who are we trying to get to change their behavior? It's not clear at all in the calls for those marches. The list of demands aren't really demands. They're saying that we want these things, but they're not strategic or tactical in that way. On the other hand, those marches show a general consensus that there should be change. So I think we need to see that both as a problem and also as an opportunity for us to do more education, more mass community grassroots building.